This is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Check out Locals for any new updates and any future support. And those for already supporting, thank you very much. So I'm joined by Logos and Andrew Stratelates to talk about the Platonic dialogue on epistemology, the Theaetetus. So the opening of the Theaetetus is a slave is reading a narrative about a conversation that Theaetetus, when he was a boy, had with Socrates and Theodorus. And Socrates at this point has just been killed. It's 399, it's 367 at Megara, BC, but Socrates has been dead for a while now. And then gives the description of these events that happened, which ultimately become this excursus on epistemology. But before we actually get into sort of like the philosophy, the one thing that I thought was really interesting about the setup is that you just have these guys that could just walk around on the street and then talk philosophy to each other and would just sort of help signal boost each other. So like, hey, Socrates, Theaetetus is this new up and coming star. Why don't you help, get him ready for business? And this sort of like networking amongst men and philosophers, it's just totally gone now. And just seeing it in this sort of organic unfolding way, I just thought was really sort of nostalgic. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting, right? Because even though it's a literate society, we're seeing something that is a lot more peer-to-peer and sort of a living in the life of the city than even the sort of philosophy that we see in 500 AD, right? Where the majority of the interactions is based on writing in one sense or another, right? Either through the corpus or through letters sent to each other rather than this direct discussion in the community.
Is there anything you want to say on that topic specifically, Logos?
Yeah, it's just really interesting how population scaling can alter dynamics a lot. I mean, you're the historian, Todd. What was the population of Athens during this time, do you think?
I think at its peak it was like 30 or 40,000.
Yeah, I mean that's smaller than some small towns in America, and it's like is it any wonder that we're having these problems? It's easy to network when you know few enough people that you know who's who, and you can like direct people to go see who to talk to for this and that. But if you're in a city with like tens of millions of people in some instances, like good luck with that. So yeah, I think one of the things we'll be nostalgic for is just that there were few enough people that we knew that we could actually like have these reasonable discussions. But now talking about people in the abstract with like this cloud of electrons, it's like good luck finding the one you want to talk to, right?
Exactly. So one of the way that this starts is Theodorus introduces Theaetetus to Socrates, and he introduces the idea of being a midwife to an idea. We also see this in the symposium. But what he says is that when you debate with people and discuss with people and they get frustrated and have these moments, it's because that's their quote unquote birth pangs as you give birth to an idea in their head. Now, part of this can be pointed to as a recapitulation, or recollection rather, where you bring the ideas back out from them. But I think you can also view it as giving birth to something that's new, because obviously Plato does in other places talk about quote unquote new ideas that are being brought into the world. And what's interesting about this, I don't want to spend too much time on it, is if you look at Plato's view of the chariot, the black horse of appetite, the white horse of spirit, and the charioteer of reason, which he talks about in the Phaedrus, and then you map it on to the love of Eros, you have the highest form giving birth to an idea as a part of this continuum of Eros. And so the idea within Platonic philosophy then develops that the highest form of Eros is contemplation of the divine forms and giving birth to new philosophical ideas. And when they start talking about knowledge, he starts asking him, okay, well, show me your stuff, kid, about math. And, Theaetetus is a math whiz, I guess. And then Socrates is like, well, what's knowledge? And Theaetetus says, well, knowledge is just what people do. If you're a cow breeder, you have knowledge of cows. If you have a merchant, you have knowledge of money. If you're a carpenter, you have knowledge of wood making. And then Socrates says, well, that's just self-referential. You can't point to what the person does and say that that's knowledge. You have to say, knowledge is something that stands over and above that. And then he gets into this excursus where, okay, well, Theaetetus, because he's a part of the school of flux of Heraclitus and Parmenides, seems to think that knowledge and wisdom are the same thing. Now, what's interesting is what we can say, minimally speaking, from the Cratylus, that the name givers were understood by Socrates and by Plato, the author of the dialogue, to have wisdom and knowledge mean approximately the same thing. Knowledge means to have perception of motion, wisdom is to have perception of motion, and knowledge is to not get too far, too much behind the object in motion, which does seem to be the same thing. So it's an interesting parallel that at least the original name givers that Plato is having this discussion with in the Cratylus would agree with Heraclitus and Theaetetus. So, Logos, what are some of your thoughts on the first round of debate here?
The first thing that I want to point out is some people can point at what Socrates says here and go, yeah, of course, you can't just like talk about like the physical stuff you do as knowledge. But this is actually a really, really deep debate that even cuts to the heart of modern politics. So when I read that passage, the very, very first thing I thought of is that whole adage, those who can do, those who can't teach. And this idea between teaching and doing that also shows up in like Skin in the Game, Nasib Taleb and people like that. And so on the one hand, people who want to say knowledge has to have this component, want to say that like knowledge is acting out in the world. It's taking what you believe to be true, applying it to reality, and seeing what happens, right? So like you and I have talked about like no a priori politics, for example. You should have some knowledge of the way the world works to know like how you're going to act within it. And I think that's the element that that was trying to be impressed upon here, right? You know about a craft because you can show me what you can do with that craft. And I think Socrates might have been a little too quick to dismiss that. So I think what Socrates is looking for here is a sufficient condition for knowledge. And what he was given is kind of a necessary condition for knowledge. Maybe that's debatable. And he doesn't like that. But I think in the modern parlance, if we like hindsight's 2020, right? But if we were to put it to Socrates that, okay, but you've at least got perhaps a necessary condition here. Let's slog through it and see. From necessary conditions, you can weaken them or tweak them in some way to sometimes find sufficient ones. A, if and only if B. And so I thought that start was kind of disappointing. But I know that Socrates, it's part of the Elenchus, right? Basically, the idea is take beauty, take justice, take anything, right? What's beauty? Well, I can show you this beautiful painting. I can show you this beautiful woman. I can show you this beautiful sunset. No. I don't want to see things that are beautiful. I want to know why you can call the things beautiful in the first place. What does beauty have in common? Similarly, take all these different crafts and politicians and whatever. Look at what they do. And they know what they do because they do it. Well, okay, what is the commonality between what they do or what they know about what they do that lets you talk about knowledge at all? So it's also trying to get at the heart of the circularity in language. So on the one hand, this can't be wholly circular. They know things because they know them, or beauty is this beautiful thing, when you're really trying to get at like linguistic justification for invoking the concept at all. But on the other hand, I think even if you can't satisfy the full circularity, I think the necessary condition's a good starting point. So that's my first comment.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, just sort of elaborating on that, I tend to be sort of Heraclitean or Stoic and believe that knowledge is like the instantiation of it in sort of this practical wisdom. And that sort of colors how I look at this. But I think a really important part is, in fact, that the knowledge that is encoded in behavior, right, of someone who is a merchant isn't necessarily easy to map into language, or it might not be possible at all to map into language. And this gets into the question of true names, right? That knowledge or wisdom might not have a true name that can be articulated by humans, and to some extent, one extent or another. And I think this is sort of what some of the negative space of this dialogue and the prior one is sort of bringing about, right? That that there's something going on in this sort of phronosis or articulation of knowledge in behavior that itself is not something that we can name very explicitly.
Right. So when he identifies Heraclitus, he says that if Heraclitus is true, then there are no objects that exist over time. Now, we already get a taste for his objections to Heraclitus in the Cratylus and his criticism of the name givers, but then there isn't anything that those names can refer to. And if those things don't persist over time, are they actually things at all? Or are they just something else? And then Parmenides is famous for saying man is the measure of all things, which, of course, Socrates also takes issue with. There's a lot of different arguments he produces to attack the man is the measure of all things, and knowledge is perception, which is closely tied to that. One is the wind. If one man says that the wind blowing is cold, another man says the wind blowing is hot, or rather not cold, it's just whatever. Is the coldness in the wind and the not coldness in the wind, or is it somewhere else? Where is it in? Is it in the person who perceives it, or is it in the wind itself? He then says also, well, then why not have animals have perception? Why wouldn't we hold animals' perception to be as good as our own and hold them on the same level? One, I think, one has to imagine him thinking that, would we have animals on a court case? Well, if it's just perceiving entities, and one perception is good as another. Animals can perceive too; they just lack speech. And he says that that's absurd. Now, modern day philosophers might not think that that's such an obviously absurd claim, but that's one Socrates thought. And then he also says two gods perceive. So are you saying that they're just as human perceptions are just as good as theirs, which is obviously absurd because the gods are immortal and have perfected senses. And then he also says, well, then if it's just perception and two people perceive the same thing but come to different conclusions, well, what do you do with that? Because then there's no way to adjudicate. There's just a hard impasse, unless you can. I guess you could just convince people in a Rortian sense that they should agree with you, but that's just you using rhetoric to convince them that your perception is more valid than someone else's. So let's cut it off here. Logos, what is your thought on those arguments thus far against Parmenides and Heraclitus?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to say is looking at this dialogue as in hindsight, right? Given all the philosophy and stuff, it's interesting that you mentioned Rorty, right? Because pragmatism seems to be the giant elephant in the room. It's more than an elephant in the room. It's like the megalodon in the room in this whole dialogue. So two people sense the same wind. One says it's hot, one says it's cold. Or, one doesn't think it's cold, one does. Well, where is this cold and not cold? Is it in the wind? Well, no, it's in the interaction between the wind and the nervous system, that's feeling the wind. It's like people arguing over the temperature of the house. The temperature is what the temperature is, but hotness and coldness are things you say about the temperature. They're normative things. If it's too hot, that's a normative wish that it was cooler. If it's too cold, that's the normative wish that it was warmer. So if the thermometer in the house says 71 Celsius or whatever, 71 Fahrenheit, Celsius, man, it's too early. Okay, 71 Fahrenheit, right? 71 Fahrenheit isn't the same as too hot or too cold. That's not in the temperature. The hot or cold is squarely in our perception of the temperature. And so what's getting confused and muddled here is normative statements about the way things are. The wind is too cold versus just the way things are. The wind has this temperature with this chill factor, and some people can tolerate it and some can't. So that's the first thing that I think is missed, that we have in hindsight that Plato didn't have at the time, is just the is-ought distinction. One of the few things we can kind of thank David Hume for. The other thing too. So, shoot, I was so wrapped up in thinking about what I want to say about the wind. What did you say after the wind? What was the next example after that?
Well, one person observes one thing, another person observes another thing. They observe the same thing, but their perceptions are radically different, if not contradictory. How then does one adjudicate? Because man's perception is the measure of all things.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that picture that you see online, right? Where two people are on different sides of the number, and from one perspective, the number looks like 6, and the other perspective, the number looks like 9. And it's absolutely right from their perspective, the way the number looks like, so they're pointing at it and going, there, see? I mean, on the one hand, right? On the one hand, you want to say there should be some greater fact of the matter than this. On the other hand, court cases are just kind of predicated on the fact that we can, give all the facts to the court as we see them, give them the jury, and the jury is just going to make up their mind, come to an agreement, and them's the breaks, right? You can have people that are absolutely innocent go to prison because the jury thinks they did something wrong from their perspective of the evidence. So I think part of this dialogue is just coping with the fact that it's like a yearning for some objective set of knowledge we wish we had. Whereas real life, we just don't get to play the game of absolute certain knowledge in very, very real context like law. So that's the other thing I wanted to say.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, I guess riffing off of this, taking a little different direction, is the perception varies depending on the person, but there's another layer as well where we can actually perceive the difference in perception, and that is sort of the upside down way to look at it, right? Is that it's not so much that man defines the measure of all things, but man is fundamentally the measurement device we use for all things, and we have to take that into account as well. And this, I think, comes into actually like knowing thyself or knowing the nature of things, right? That if we are the fundamental instrument that we use to measure or know things, then we have to know about our nature as well in order to use that well.
Right. So the at the end of his original attack on Heraclitus, Socrates comes to these conclusions. Qualities have no independent existence in time and space. Qualities do not exist except in perceptions of them. So, right, that's the everything is flux. We've already seen that also fleshed out in the Cratylus. Perceptions don't exist. Qualities do not exist except in those perceiving them. That's the wind and the object that both people see. And then the dice paradox: changes in things' quantities are not so much changes in the thing as in the perceptions of the thing. And then he moves on to this weird discussion about dreams. He's like, okay, so if I perceive one thing in the waking and I perceive another thing in the dream, first of all, what's real? The thing I perceive in the dream or the thing that I perceive in reality? And how can we tell when we're dreaming or in reality? And then he tells Theaetetus that, well, on your model, that of Parmenides, basically what you have to say is that both are true and both are real. And then there's this real perception of a dream Theaetetus of what he perceived in the dream. And then there's a real Theaetetus in like IRL who then perceives it in life. And he says that just creates something weird because are these two Theaetetuses the same Theaetetus? And he says, that seems to be an indication that this is a false theory. So what are your thoughts on that, Logos?
The first thing I thought of when I read that section was actually Descartes and Descartes' meditations. And so instead of the dream versus reality, let's just think of Descartes' demon and reality. So let's suppose there were something over and above our perception that we were supposed to like hold reality to be. Well, if there are these fundamental elements of reality over and above our perception that make up reality, then any entity that could manipulate those fundamental entities, independent of our perceiving them or not, could manipulate whether or not what we're doing is real. And so this is how you end up getting things like Descartes' demon, right? So we have our perceptions, but our perceptions may or may not map onto anything real because some demon could be manipulating things behind the scenes, pulling levers, whatever. And so our mind is constructing something we're doing, but we're doing something completely different. And so that Descartes has to go into his whole meditations and work through that. And so this seems like a very, very proto version of that, where the dreams are basically taking the role of the demon. Now, the other question too is like, well, are all perceptions equal? And there are so many senses that we can like look into this, right? So the way, if I touch my arm now, or I dream about touching my arm, right? I'm perceiving my touching my arm in two senses, but they have to be like really, really different. If you ask most people, because you don't even have to think about dreams, right? think about thoughts. Like if I have a thought in my head where I think about myself touching my arm, does that count as a perception? Well, kind of. I mean, we use the idea of like the mind's eye all the time. Mathematicians draw pictures in their head and so on. So this idea that we can like abstract our perceptions into the mental or the dreamlike, but they're not the same kind of perceptions in reality. If I dream about being Bill Gates, it doesn't make me Bill Gates. And so so yeah, we have to have some natural separation between the perceptions we can have in dreams and the perceptions we can have in reality. And as much as Socrates wants to say this works with him, it might actually work a little bit against him, because let's think about recollection for a second, right? If the body's a prison, as we saw in the Phaedo, if the body's a prison and we have all these things battering up against us, hungers and lusts and thirsts for adventure and all the rest of it, and we're always being bombarded with this, where do we get any peace from that? If it's anywhere we get any peace from that, that we can, quiet our minds, quiet everything, I would think it's when we're asleep. It's when we're asleep that we enter a state that could, in theory, bring us closer to recollection without the turbulence of the prison life, so to speak, that we experience every day. And so Socrates seems to be in the unfortunate position of saying that we're mixing real perceptions up with dream perceptions, and that's why this everything is perception theory doesn't work, because he's privileging the real ones. But it seems like what he'll actually want to do is privilege the dream ones. But if he does that, what's to stop the other person from saying is, well, it's not the same you that's perceiving these. In fact, the dream ones might even be better, given what you've said about the body being a prison and other things. And so it's not really clear to me that the argument does what he wants it to do. It could even be the argument backfires against him once you bring in the extra scope of his philosophy.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I this seems somewhat related to this understanding of what a cataleptic impression is from the Stoics, which is basically an impression or perception that you can have certainty in being reflective of reality, right? And basically, this comes down to, can you know if you're dreaming or not? And there's sort of an asymmetry with dreaming specifically, that when you're dreaming, oftentimes you don't know if you're dreaming. But when you are waking, you remember dreams that you have, and I'm very aware of that distinction. And like one of the key questions is whether or not that type of perception can be falsified by anything. Or not falsified, but can be caused by anything else than reality itself. And maybe that's a more simplistic way to look at this problem, but that's related.
I think one of the key points that Socrates is trying to draw out here is with Parmenides, if all perceptions are equally valid, then you come up with contradictions. Like one contradiction of, well, then you the statement that this perception is valid for all people, but then someone perceives this perception not be valid for that person, then creates a contradiction in his mind, and he seems to tell Theaetetus that, hey, well, look, if Parmenides is true, then there's this contradiction where we can't actually determine what is true within the realm of perceptions. What are your thoughts on that, Logos?
Yeah, I think that's actually inevitable. I mean, look at all the reasons that people have gone to war throughout history. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's at least one war in history where two sides had a grievance against each other, and both were actually right in the stuff they thought the other person was subjecting them to. Um, I mean, the question is that an actual contradiction of the form? So this is where it gets really, really interesting, right? Because there's a contradiction of the form like P and not P. But what I think's missing here, this extra machinery, is the idea of conditioning, right? So, for example, I cannot roll a dice and get like a number that is both maybe that's a bad example. The idea I'm trying to bring about is, instead of looking at just like P and not P, think of P conditioned on C1 and not P conditioned on C2. Oh, here we go, right? Duh, I should have thought of this example earlier. Think about a door. A door cannot be open and closed at the same time. But a door could be open at 7:30 a.m. when people leave for work, and it can be closed everywhere else. Yeah. So this idea that, if you devoid everything of all context, and somebody says, yeah, my door was open this morning and it's closed this afternoon, well, door can't be opening and closed at the same time. So what gives? You just not have a door? Are you lying to me? What's going on? I think the idea is, well, conditioning on different things can be true. And that's like the logical machinery that seems to be missing here. So the contradiction's a little bit more elusive than he's making it out to be.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think that's yeah.
Right. And so because basically there's these sort of like higher level perceptions of belief. So there's like because there's a distinction between the perception and then the judgment one makes on the perception. And that sort of gets back to what you were saying, Logos, about a court case. People have all these perceptions that may or may not contradict, but the other then problem is how they then draw judgments from those perceptions. But then there's like perceptions on perception. So, if all beliefs are true, and then, does that entail then that the beliefs about beliefs that are better than others are true as somebody who holds the belief that that particular belief is not better than someone else's belief? And so now there's like layers of perception and belief that could theoretically be infinite. And, basically Socrates is saying that this is just nonsense. This is going to make a mess out of everything. Logos.
Yeah, this gets at the trilemma in epistemology, which is apt because this is a dialogue about epistemology, where you've got the idea of infinite foundations, where you've got like infinite levels of justification. You've got the foundational level of justification, and you have the coherentist view, where you've just got like webs of beliefs connecting to other beliefs. And it seems to me like Protagoras seems to be kind of like a coherentist, where people in their everyday lives don't have enough time in the world to infinitely justify their justifications. They'll just kind of like have them. And people don't often think in foundational terms. What they perceive, they sense, they whatever, they just act in the world. And they touch a stove and it's hot, they don't want to do that, and they build this house and it's standing and it works, and I want to do that some more, right? And I want to get paid for it. So Protagoras seems to be kind of, at the end of the day, a coherentist. And it sounds like Socrates, I think, wants to be more of a foundationalist, because the buck has to stop somewhere. So let's go back to the original answer that Theaetetus, or I'm terrible at pronouncing these names, gives, where he says like knowledge is what each of these people do. And what he seems to be implicitly saying is, this idea I have of knowledge is a coherent network of all these things I see people acting out in the world. It's this implicit bundle of that experience, right? It's like the locus of this web of people doing stuff. And what Socrates is saying is, well, none of this stuff is actually defensible without a foundation on which all of it rests. I want to know what the fundamental pillar of this thing called knowledge is, and then we can build everything out from that. And so this actually seems like a weird dialogue if we look at it from the meta level. It seems like a weird dialogue where you have a coherentist implicitly agreeing with a foundationalist, causing like this weird shift in views throughout the nature of a dialogue.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, and I sort of personally take a view somewhere between foundationalism and coherentism, where I believe that the way you get knowledge is through foundational beliefs and cataleptic impressions, but that people functionally end up being coherentists oftentimes. And I also feel like this is a great example of one of the typical Socratic things, where as Socrates talks with someone, their view shifts, right? And so that's also occurring.
Right. And sort of the last major objection that he has to Protagoras is that for Protagoras, his theory of perceptions is general in its application, but justice in a city is relative or particular to each city's. But then how then do you tie the judgments in justice together with the judgments of perception? And then Socrates seems to believe that Protagoras does want to view justice as individually applied to the cities, not as some general concept. So then you just have to have this conceptual divorce. And this is a conceptual divorce that Socrates doesn't find very satisfying or convincing. What are your thoughts on that, Logos?
Sorry, I heard some of that, but some of it came by a little quick. Run that by me again real fast.
Right. So the problem is that, according to Socrates, Protagoras' theory of like perceptions is in general application. So this is a general rule for general application. But then he wants to say that justice within cities deals with what benefits the cities, and that's not general, that's just specific to those cities. But then justice is based on perception, or at least what is justice, right? Justice is an abstract concept. Maybe you could say applied justice is different, right? And then he says, well, Protagoras then has to then divorce the two and say that these are just, it just limits the scope of his theory, which he says then just creates more problems.
Okay, now I know why I got confused, because I heard the first part very, very well, and then I heard you talking about cities, and I missed a gap like in between those somehow. And I'm like, how do we go from talking about this to cities? Okay, now I get it. This actually strikes me as a very common criticism that I hear about any even quasi-relativistic views of truth, right? I see this a lot in like Greg Kogel's Tactics and other works like that, where some people say, truths are relative. And somebody says, well, is that true? And that seems to be at the heart of the whole local versus particular question, right? Because what we want to say is we have like these local principles at which truth is relative, but they're also shrouded in this like more absolute claim that truth is relative. And so it's relatively true that truths are relatively true, which ends up being kind of circular and self-defeating. And so I think another bit of machinery that'll help the analysis here is what I found helpful is orders of logic and orders of propositions. So you have first order propositions, which are about things, objects, people, sets, and so on. And you have second order propositions, which are propositions about propositions. And so if we want to say something like what Protagoras seems to be saying in modern language, it would be something like first order propositions about stuff and things in the world are filtered through our experience, like our truth function on those things, or how we evaluate them or make sense of them, is based on experience. And then what we're saying is, well, that principle is kind of like a second order proposition because it's talking about first order propositions. And so in the sense that cities are dealing with local matters of justice, you have these first order cases. This person did this thing at this time, and both people are going to argue their reasons and everything else. They're going to generate a whole bunch of facts for a court. And on the basis of those first order facts, this is what they do. And then this principle is really only just kind of describing what's being done as these deal with these local first level like things of logic. It's kind of like a second order principle that's not trying to be subject to itself, right? It's the whole problem we had with what's its name? Positivism, right? Logical positivism. It's that same type of thing where you can kind of avoid the self-reference problem in these things by invoking different orders of propositions to narrow the scope. And that way these things don't end up getting caught in their own crossfire. And I think what's going to have to be done to rectify that is going to be something like that, which is going to have to be done anyway, because where this is going, we're not here yet. The second half of the dialogue we get to is going to get at the other definition of knowledge, which is like true beliefs. And it turns out that doesn't work out very well either. And one of the reasons that doesn't work out either is because we've decided that, we actually need justified true beliefs. And Socrates is appealing to the idea of like justification. That's not good enough either, as we'll talk about next time. But where this is actually heading to is where do our justifications come from? And what you're pointing out here is like, if everything is relative, then our justifications are relative. And so, like, if we have relative things peeking in on the first order stuff about people and things and whatnot, but our justifications are also relative. Any justifications are as good as any other ones, and so that's just going to cause a lot of issues. And so what we're going to have to do is work really, really hard to separate descriptions about justifications from making justifications like relative caught in their own fog of war. It's going to be something like that.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of one of the key things, right? Is that any of these simple models themselves do not fulfill everything we want, or desire them to. So it has to be something that is not in any of the simple ones alone, right?
Right. So with the digression, which has this comedic effect, there is some debate over what's the point of it. One thing is it's a useful way to break the two discussions. So you can have this, you're talking about one kind of truth and knowledge, and then you go into the other. And there's the transition element, which is this, discussion about justice in the city. And Socrates rather playfully says that the philosopher is a freeborn man, and the civil servant is a slave, just being henpecked and pulled around. But one of the values within this digression is the fact that, well, when we talk about justice and perceptions and knowledge and perceptions and knowledge of justice, these are a whole bunch of like nested questions that if you pull at one, you end up seeing this connected to a whole bunch of other things you have to also answer. And a lot of your answers are already preloaded with assumptions that you maybe didn't already know you had until that gets pulled out. And then the thing is, if the justice in the city is just, relative to these perceptions of people within the city, then how can justice be knowledge of the law and injustice be ignorance of the law? Just knowledge or ignorance of what? If there's no, justice out there, and it's just all a bunch of just, random perceptions, thrown into a blender, then ignorance and knowledge of a thing are irrelevant. Logos.
Yeah, I mean, one way of resolving that is well, this is like really quite a tangle. We're about to start getting into like epistemology, ethics, and all sorts of stuff. So I'm gonna try to do my best here. This is gonna get nasty. Okay, so epistemically speaking, like, what are people ignorant of? Well, to play ultra charitably with the hardcore relativist view, I could say something like this. Justice has to do with the city's laws and perceptions, and so the laws are just what the city finds acceptable based on its perceptions, values, and so on. And so injustice is ignorance of the law, which just being injustice is ignorance of whatever that city values. You're acting out of accord with what your city values. Now, the question is, I mean, that seems to be kind of like a self-contained view. It kind of ties all the knots, but there's some ethical problems with it. So now I have to move from epistemology to ethics. We have to talk about, like, well, what about people who believe that their city's acting immorally? And so you have like I forget the name that they give these people. They're changers. Anyway, they make things better. And so the idea is, if everything is just a self-perpetuating idea of what the city finds valuable, there's no, like, say, moral change. But there is moral change. And so there has to be something outside of that that you can appeal to kind of talk about that dynamic. And so that gets into the question of like higher order stuff. Like, okay, so at one level, we can talk about ignorance of the law as it currently is. And then at a higher level, we can talk about like what ought the laws to be. And so somebody could be ignorant of the law as it is. And then we have to talk about, could the laws be otherwise such that their ignorance wouldn't be a problem? And that gets to the heart of, say, moral permissivity, and is there such thing as moral progress, and so on. The other thing, of course, to add into this is like Moore's open question. I mean, the big issue here is, suppose that there was some laws out there and some like fundamental thing that was doing all this heavy lifting. Moore's open question would say, even if we had this like list of oughts all in front of us, ought we accept those oughts? It's a non-trivial question, and we know it's non-trivial because people can agree and disagree, whatever the thing is. Well, what determines that? What determines whether somebody's going to agree or disagree with a law, like descriptively? It seems to be their perceptions in some regard or another. And so we have this issue where it can't just be whatever the city wants it to be as far as morality goes, because things can change, and how do they change? But it can't be perfectly static either, because so it seems like the moral change issue happens on both a purely static view of morality and a purely relative view of morality. On the static view, Moore's open question dictates that if enough people disagree with the odds as given, they're going to change. And that gives the mechanism for what's going on. And so that leads things in the relative direction. But if you go too far, relatively speaking, just whatever the mob wants is whatever the laws are, and there's nothing outside of that. So what determines what the mob wants? And so that's going to lean it in towards the principled version, because there should be some kinds of principles that determine what the mob wants and what's going to change the mob. And so you end up getting this kind of like middle ground position that I naively think people accept more on the epistemological and ethical space for this type of problem.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, and it's sort of implicit in this too, right? That depending on the actual beliefs you have about epistemology, that will also determine your perception of these things as well, right? So there's a cascade of layers going on with your prior beliefs actually affecting how you perceive things.
Right, and of course, one of the things that we see throughout this dialogue, the Theaetetus, is that we see this like classic sort of Platonic or Socratic playfulness. He's clearly like, in arguing against an imaginary. Protagoras is already dead, so he's arguing against, it's sort of basically the original empty chair debate, like when William Lane Craig had the empty chair debate against Richard Dawkins. This is sort of like his version of the empty chair debate. He's debating against a guy that's not there anymore. This reason because he's dead. And then he puts words in his mouth as a sort of like possible response. And Theodorus says, yeah, that's kind of funny. And then he talks about, animals and pigs and saying, well, their perceptions are just as good as humans. And there's this kind of like wit and sarcasm that we see with Plato that I think is kind of new in literature, right? Because if you read like Homer, of course, there are some funny moments, like when Ajax is in a foot race with Odysseus and trips and falls in horse poo or something. But it's not like these are witty, humorous people that are jabbing at each other. I think partly because that represents a sort of aristocratic society, pre-literate, or at least literate only in a very narrow sense, and certainly pre-democratic. And when we see literature arising again, this time the Platonic dialogues, we see that there's a different sense. I wouldn't say it's less serious, because I think that the dialogues do deal with serious, deep issues. But there's a level of playfulness that's there that maybe you could say it's the result of, popular life rather than aristocratic life. Maybe you could say it's the result of a wider level of literacy. But it does seem to be a bit of a shift in the overall literary traditions of ancient Greece or even the Near East. There's not a lot of humor in Near Eastern literature either. So it does seem that, and again, but humor at this time is being invented in the Athenian plays. So there seems to be something about Athens that creates this new literary style of humor. And then, of course, Plato is using this in his dialogues to, poke fun at his opponents. Logos, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, it seems to be kind of like a meta reflection on the trends. So how do I describe this? So I think that when societies were more impoverished and things were more dire, they took a serious tone because their works were to convey the beliefs of society, to convey the history, and they wanted to kind of get things out and deal with them. They couldn't be too jokey. They couldn't have people miss the forest for the trees as far as what the intent of the works were. Because time was more scarce, resources were more scarce. You could die tomorrow. If you could die tomorrow and you're trying to get history down, maybe let's take the humor out and just kind of like go with it. Athenian society is a society where things aren't that bad. They own slaves. They have a marketplace where they just gonna walk around and talk about philosophy. I don't think they're worried about getting crushed by invaders anytime soon. Like, there have been some wars like with Sparta and with Persia and stuff, but they seem to have held their own. They seem to be doing all right. And so, you know, in this time in human history, people can kind of look back in on their society in ways they couldn't do before and find humor in it, whether it's traditions of the past, the way things are in society, and so on. So while Socrates doesn't wants to say that things aren't in people's perceptions, the very fact that this dialogue is allowing the things to be this humorous, it seems to me is kind of like a foil to the point. We can talk this way and be this humorous and have these jokes instead of jokes because they're in this kind of like well-off society that has time for these things, and so they have the extra time to perceive the world in these extra layers of depth, whereas other societies may not have had. And so, yeah, you're going to be able to do things with people's perceptions that you couldn't do otherwise. I think that's just something interesting to think about.
Well, another thing too, Logos, is this is the rise of a more literate society. So previous stories were told by oral repetition. And so it was only really the people that were the bards that knew all these stories. And without a backlog of stories to read through and reflect on, it's a little bit hard to find patterns to make fun of. But if you have it in print, written down, you can look at it, read a whole bunch of stories over time. You don't have to keep it in your head all the time. And so now a broader group of people could more easily have this pattern recognition possibility by reading text.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because remember we were talking about the laws, right? So um, we want to talk about like being ignorant of the law as the city's current like taboos, let's say. But what determines the city's current taboos? How do you change them? How do you critique them? Add on to them? Whatever. There could be something about that too. Uh, Once the laws are in writing, once you can see how there's a historical record of them, and so on. Once you can see their outcomes, then you can start having these higher level criticisms of the laws. And so there's something about putting truths in writing that's over and above hearing them once or twice verbally. And so people can think about the truths based on the perception or the way they encounter the ideas. A really extreme version of this, Todd, something we've talked about is in modern advertising, the medium is the message. So it's something that we've talked about. So we know this. I think this is something that was just being noticed back then. The fact that this thing is written gives a different characteristic based on the medium than it would have been otherwise.
Right, Andrew.
One thing we have to be careful about is the written records we have are incomplete. So we have the Platonic dialogues because people thought they were important, but we don't have any stand-up comedians' written notes, even if they did write them. And so I agree that there was time for reflection in Athens. I'm just hesitant to say that this is the first time that it occurred, or that it didn't happen in other places like Sumeria or Phoenicia, where they wrote on papyrus. Just to use Phoenicia as an example, and we don't have the records.
Well, maybe we could minimally say this is the first time a sufficient body of humorous material was written that survived, that it makes a indentation or impression on history.
Yeah, and it definitely is like the reservoir that our history comes from, right? That this sense of humor percolated through the Greeks, and then the Roman Empire, which is basically all of what we call the West, right?
Right. So now we're nearing the end of the hour. Logos, what are some of your thoughts on this Theaetetus this far?
I think this part is, I hesitate to say boring because I like Plato, but it was kind of a slog to get through because it feels like we're dealing with the part that I think in modern times we think is a lot less interesting. Well, let me take that back, right? I think all three of us here know why we disagree with some of like the very, very extreme views of epistemology that Socrates is dealing with here. And so it's kind of difficult to read because like, yes, of course, Socrates. And so it's hard to get through some of the arguments. But on the other hand, maybe Socrates is being a little too uncharitable. Like, how has stuff survived this long if it's this obviously debunked? How does it keep showing up in our politics? Why do we keep saying those who can do, those who can't teach, and keep giving control over schools and institutions to certain ideological people? Why do we keep thinking that successful people in business or some area of society have a lot to say about everything? Like, why does this keep coming back over and over and over again? Why do we keep equating materialistic success with academic or with academic or knowledge success? So there's something about this that's really, really hard to shake. And if it was easy to dispel as Socrates' arguments, I think less people would fall for it. So that's the interesting conversation to be had there. As far as the dialogue goes, I'm more looking forward to the second half when we get to knowledge as true beliefs, because then we get to talk about justified true beliefs, and then we get to talk about Gettier cases. And Gettier cases are like really, really fascinating. So I think that's the part I'm looking forward to most.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, I agree. Right, that especially this one, because I have more in epistemology. It sort of just feels like a better trodden territory than some of the other dialogues we've done. But.
Right. I think what you guys are saying is familiarity breeds contempt. But what I would say, though, is go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, exactly.
But I would say that I'm broadly sympathetic to Socrates' or maybe they're Plato's critiques of Heraclitus and Protagoras. And we definitely do see them reemerging in modern times. In fact, a lot of the philosophical archetypes that Socrates is dealing with are reappearing in modern times. And I think what I'll say is one of the reasons why they seem to be appearing again is because there's a certain set of like conditions under which they arise, right? Athens is a commercial urban society, and the modern day West, especially the United States, is a urban commercial society. So it almost seems to be that's like the material conditions from which these competing discussions and debates and ideas come from. So, for example, Sparta doesn't have any of these debates. It's just, it's just like this sort of like stiff upper lip, train for war, and let's go. There's none of this going on, but Sparta was a slave-based aristocratic society training for war. Thank you, Logos. Thank you, Andrew. This is Praise of Folly Podcast, signing off.